let's get started. Just to kind of reiterate right from the outset what we're doing, our goal is to do essentially two things. This is week number 3, so we've got 7 more. But our goal is to look at a number of Old Testament stories and to, first of all, create an understanding of how to read them. Old Testament stories can be a little trickier than just what I find on the surface when I read the text. And so we're trying to develop an understanding of how to read them. And then 2, we're trying to develop an understanding of how to apply the truth we find in these stories. So we're essentially looking to figure out how we mine the truth out of these stories. And then we're going to try to figure out how we apply that truth together. And what I'm hoping happens for all of us, me included, actually, is that as we continue, we'll start to see some patterns develop in the way we read and interact with these stories, and then we can lift that pattern off of the stories we've seen and apply it to other places in the text. So today we are going to do our best to take a look at Genesis 1 and 2. Now, right from the outset, I'll tell you it's entirely possible this may be 2 weeks, like David and Goliath was. But there's a lot of information packed into these 2 chapters. I want to try to unpack some of it together because I think the why is important. I don't think the reason Genesis 1 and 2 are set side by side, and let me back up just a second. Genesis 1 and 2 paint 2 different stories of creation. They're 2 versions of the creation story. Now, I think the reason there are 2 stories is probably simple, but simple does not necessarily mean easy. And I want us to take some time to really dig into some of the truth we find in these stories, even some of the structure and the form of how they were written, maybe some of the why they were written, and then figure out from there what we do with that information and why it matters and how we not only extract truth from it, but how we apply those truths to our everyday life. So we're going to dive right into Genesis chapter 1. And as we do, I want us to understand a little bit about Genesis chapter 1, because if you were to look in your Bible at Genesis chapter 1, Genesis 1 through 131 is the entire chapter, but that's not the entire first creation story. In fact, the first creation story goes from Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 2 verse 3. And this is the story of the 7 days of creation. Most of us are probably at least somewhat familiar with what's happening in the text here. And then in Genesis 2 verse 4, we pick up the second version of creation, and that version goes from 2:4 to 2:25. And both of these stories essentially tell the same information, but they do it from 2 very different perspectives. And the reason I want to start here is because Genesis 2:4, something really interesting happens in Genesis 2:4. And what we find is the text says this: "This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens." But the phrase right at the beginning of 2:4 says, "This is the account of the heavens and the earth." Now, the word here that we've translated in the NIV to account is a Hebrew word, toledot. It literally translates generations. And when we find in the book of Genesis and elsewhere in the Old Testament, when we find lists of names where the Bible is outlining sons of a father and they create these lists of generations, the word toledot is the word generations. Now, why this is interesting in Genesis 2 verse 4 is the reason we know this is the start of the second creation story is because of this one phrase. This is the account. This is the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created. Now, this exact structure happens 10 times in the book of Genesis. Okay? Every time Genesis starts a new family tradition line series of stories. It starts with this same phrase. It happens in Genesis 2:4, right? This is the generations of the heavens and the earth. In Genesis 5:1, we find these are the generations of Adam. And then it goes on to list Adam's sons. In Genesis 6:9, we find these are the generations of Noah. And it goes on to list Noah's sons. This happens 10 times, all the way up to Genesis 37, verse 2, where we find these are the generations of Jacob. And then the text goes on to tell us the stories of the sons of Jacob. So the book of Genesis is actually sectioned on its own into 10 divisions, essentially, and each section records one family line and teaches about one family line, and it includes the stories of those men in that family. Now, the reason we start here at Genesis 2:4 is because the account of creation in Genesis 2, verse 4 through verse 25, most scholars believe is older than Genesis 1. In fact, most scholars believe that the book of Genesis in its original form, depending on who you ask, it was either a collection of documents written by 4 different sources or Moses wrote it, but either way you go, they believe Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 through the end was a single unified work that was laid out to set up the generations of these 10 sections of story. Now, one of the reasons that's interesting is because the rest of Genesis doesn't focus on creation. In fact, creation is really only found in these first 2 chapters. The rest of the book of Genesis is the beginning of the story of salvation. In fact, the Jewish rabbis who taught this text all the way clear until Christian teachers are teaching it today understand that what happens, what gets mapped out in the book of Genesis is the fall of man and then the beginning of God's redemptive work to recover man from their sin, essentially. So Genesis 2 and Genesis 1 stand alone, essentially, in the text as the stories of creation. And again, like I said a few minutes ago, most scholars believe that Genesis 1 was a later addition. Some even say it was as much later as 300 or 400 years, even all the way to the time of Isaiah, which was in the 700s BCE or BC, depending on when you had history class, depending on how they use those designations. But so because of that, we're going to take a look at the structure and the form of Genesis 1, all the way up to chapter 2, verse 3. And then we're going to spend some time looking at chapter 2's version of the story of creation. So in Genesis chapter 1, we start with verse 1. Now, Genesis 1, according to everybody on the face of the planet, Genesis 1 in the original Hebrew language was a poem. And the reason that's important as we start this conversation is because we use poetry for very specific reasons, and that's not just true now. That's been true forever. But let's talk about it in our context. Typically, if someone is going to sit down and write a poem, they're putting an exclamation point on something that has happened in their life. As a 20 years experience as a pastor, I can tell you one of the times people write poetry a lot in their lives is at the death of someone they love. And so they use this poetic, figurative language to try to express how they're feeling when it's difficult to express an idea. The same thing happens lots of times for us guys when we're trying to swoon a woman, right? Like procreation seems to, make it important for us to use language correctly, right? And even when I was dating Chandra, I wrote some poetry for her. Hey, Tiger, if you're watching, I wrote some poetry for her. And one of the things I wrote was, "She shows me colors I have never seen." Now, what I didn't mean was she took out a box of crayons and started introducing me to colors I had never seen. Right? I'm using a figurative expression to try to explain how it felt to be around her. So poetry is not necessarily literal. Poetry as a genre uses words to express ideas that are hard to wrap our brains around in concrete language, and it does it emotionally. And we find this kind of poetry all over the place in the Hebrew texts. I want to be careful because I don't want to make it sound like I believe the Holy Spirit wasn't involved in the writing of the text. I absolutely believe that he was. But in fact, these texts were written by people. And as we get into the Psalms, we find all of these brilliantly written pieces of poetry where a man sat down and expressed in intense poetic language his experiences with God, or his experiences with the world around him, or his experiences, his emotional response to the things he was experiencing. This is the way poetry works. It helps us put language to something that's hard to wrap our brain around. Now, the reason it's important we understand Genesis 1 into the first few verses of Genesis 2 is a poem is because it's structured poetically, not like a typical story. And in that structure, we find a whole bunch of really brilliant Hebrew writing and thought processes and work in the way this, essentially this story written as a poem is laid out. So for instance, Genesis 1 teaches the idea that God created the earth in 7 days. But this number 7 comes up over and over and over again in this one chapter of Genesis. For instance, Genesis 1:1 in the Hebrew text is 7 words. So right from the very beginning, we encounter an idea that the number 7 is bigger than just the number of days of creation. It's getting worked into the poem structurally. Now, why does that matter? Why is that interesting? Well, who cares that the number 7 is already in verse 1 worked into the structure? Well, in modern times, the way we interact with our world, the way we process numbers is very different than it was for the people who were interacting with the biblical texts in the beginning. Because we process and we are taught to process our world very scientifically. And in a modern scientific technological world, it's important for our world to function that numbers mean a value, that the meaning of a number is literally just its numeric value. So for instance, the number 7, if someone says to me, hey, what does 7 mean? I'm going to try to explain that one of a couple ways. I might have 7 apples. I might have $7. I might have punch the enter key on my computer 7 times, but no matter how we break that down, it has a numeric value. Its meaning is its numeric value. Well, to the people in ancient times, this was not the only meaning of numbers. They weren't just defined numerically. Every number had an additional idea or concept attached to it. And what's interesting about the number 7 is the number 7 in the ancient Hebrew mindset was the number of completion. It was used to reference the idea of perfection sometimes. It was also used to reference the idea of rest or Sabbath. In fact, the Hebrew word 7 is directly related to the Hebrew word Sabbath, to rest. That comes out of Genesis 1. On the 7th day, God rested. So this number 7 gets played into the text. We also find that a couple other things happen. The number 3 gets played into this text quite a bit. 3 was, in the original context, the number 3 was a reference to unity, to completeness. We find the number 4 gets brought up a handful of times in Genesis 1. The number 4 was additionally a reference to completeness and to unity. We think of this similarly when we talk about mathematics. A triangle is a 3-sided, unified figure, symbol. We use the number 3 when we talk about God in Christianity. The divine, the Godhead is split into 3 pieces, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. The number 4 has some of the same representations. The number 4 shows itself up in our mathematical figures as a perfect square. The number 4 also gets brought up over and over again in the Hebrew text as we move forward. There are 4 creatures that sit around the throne room of God. They represent 4 different animals. The number 4 continues to progress long throughout the text, through the book of Revelation, in fact. What's interesting about the fact that 3 and 4 get brought up over and over again in this text is when you combine 3 and 4, you get what? 7. There's pattern. This text was written with very specific, very intentional pattern. Now, we could argue about whether that pattern was the work of a great, and I mean like really great, poetic human mind, or whether that pattern was divine in its intent. But either way you go, it doesn't change the fact that this text is full of these patterns. And you know what, let's take a minute right now and look at the pattern, one of the patterns we find in Genesis 1. I'm trying to figure out which side of the board. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so in Genesis 1, if we were to just very briefly talk our way through the 7 days of creation, on day 1, we find out that God creates the heavens and the earth. Okay? And he separates, on day 1, he separates light from darkness. Then we move on to day 2. I'm using letters to reference these now. It'll make sense why in just a second. We move on to day 2. On day 2, we're told that God creates the sky and that he separates water from water. Now, this is an interesting idea. It's an interesting idea when you think about how these people that wrote this text would probably have been thinking, because what's beyond our sky is space. They wouldn't have known this then, but astronauts need oxygen to survive in space. What's underneath our sky is ocean. We can't survive in ocean either because there's no oxygen, right? So God steps in, he creates this sky. The Hebrew text refers to it as a vault or an expanse between the waters. But so there's creation and there's separation. Okay, on the 3rd day, God creates land, and he also creates vegetation. But even on the 3rd day, there's a series of separations. We're told that God separates the land from the water. Okay. Now, what's really interesting about the structure right here is that it resets. It starts over again after day 3. So we get to day 4, which I'm going to call A1. On day 4, God creates the sun and the moon and the stars. Now, the sun, the moon, and the stars relate directly back to the first day, where God separates the heavens and the earth, and he creates the heavens and the earth, and he separates light and darkness. Now, on day 4, or A1, this pattern starts to repeat. The sun, the moon, and the stars show up, which is how he populates the heavens and the light and the darkness. Now, in B1, which becomes day 5, we find that God creates the birds and the sea creatures. This relates directly back to day number 2. We have more patterns showing up in this poem. Okay, on day 6, C1, God creates the animals and mankind, which relates back to populating the land. So God has populated the heavens, he's populated the light and the dark, he's populated the sky and the water, and now he's populated land. And then we find day 7, God rests. So there's this idea that in 3 days, number 3 represents totality, unity. In the first 3 days, God creates. In the second 3 days, God populates what he creates. And then in the final day, he rests, and you end up with this 2 sets of 3 and the number 7. Now, so this structure is embedded into the text. One of the things that I think is interesting about this we see this same thing play out even in the times that God says it is good, right? So in every day of these first 7 days of creation, God says it is good when he sees what is made at the end of the day. That happens on day 1, it's good. Day 2, it's good. Day 3, it's good. Day 4, 5, and 6, all good. When he gets to day 7, God actually says, he sees day 7 and he doesn't say it is good. He says it's really good. It's very good. It's extra good. Right? Which is interesting, again, as we come back to this idea that the number 7 represents perfection, completeness. Right? On the number 7, God says, my creation is very good. Now, we are going to erase this and go right back to Genesis 1. So my whole point of that was to show us there is this structure, and it's actually a poetic structure that gets built into the foundation of Genesis 1. We are going to pick right back up at Genesis 1:1 because in addition to the fact that there is this really cool underlying structure, in the first 2 verses of Genesis, we find themes that get played not only in the book of Genesis, but they get traced throughout the rest of our scriptures. And there are 2 themes that become very, very important, not only in helping us understand what is happening in the stories we find, but in helping us understand what's happening in the stories in the first 4 books of the New Testament about Jesus, and then helping us understand what's actually happening in the book of Revelation at the end. These first 2 verses of Genesis have a massive impact on how we interpret and read everything else from this point forward. So, Genesis 1:1. After all that introduction, we'll dive into the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was on the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. But we're going to back up and dive right back into verse 1, and we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at this chunk of text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. I want to come back to an idea that we touched on 2 weeks ago, and that we played around with just a little bit last week in the story of David and Goliath, because it's an idea that we're going to find over and over again. And the idea happens in the word formless and the word deep in Genesis chapter 1, or in Genesis 1, verse 1 and 2. So we're told that the earth was formless. Formless is the Hebrew word tohu, and it's literally T-H-O-U, essentially. If we were trying to transliterate it into English, this is what it looks like. Okay. When we get to the word deep, it's the word tehom. Now, I'm probably on the wrong side for the camera. Sorry. It's still T, it's still H, it's still U, but it ends in an M. Okay, so there's 1 letter difference between formless and deep. Now, why this matters is because one of the things we referenced a couple weeks ago was that our understanding of creation, of this idea, has borrowed these 2 words. The Hebrew language borrowed the idea of tohu and tehom from an earlier language. And the earlier language, let me say that differently, because scholarship's not entirely sure which one is first. We just know which one was written down first. But the one that was written down first used these 2 same ideas to describe primordial chaos, or literally the chaos that was before all things. Now, they didn't understand it in terms of God the way we do, as the way the scriptures do, but the word was Tiamat, and Tiamat was an ancient serpent who literally was the embodiment of chaos. And in the oldest creation story we know of, the first one that was written down is called the Enuma Elish, and it tells the story of how Tiamat, this chaos, was defeated, and how the god who defeated it split this dragon's body in half and used half of it to create the water above the earth and half of it to create the water below the earth. So there is this story outside of the Hebrew scriptures that describes a different God. This is just irrelevant at this point. Describes a God taking the chaos, dividing the chaos, and using the chaos to create. Now, one of the things that makes this story in Genesis so cool when we understand this is because what they've done is the writer looked around their world, essentially, for lack of a better way to describe it. They looked around their world and they took this story of creation and they said, gosh, do you know what? This story is wrong. That there wasn't a God named Marduk, and he didn't slaughter this giant dragon of chaos and separate its body, but there is truth here. There is something true about this story, and the thing that's true about this story is that God actually reached into what we would consider to be primordial chaos, and he used that chaos to create. Now, I'm not suggesting that God created from matter that was already there. That's not in the text. But this idea is borrowed, and what's interesting about it is the idea of a God stepping into chaos and fighting a dragon isn't just in Genesis 1:1 or Genesis 1:2. We find it in Job. We find it in Ezekiel. We find it in Isaiah. So in Job, in fact, we're told that when God created the world, he separated the waters and slaughtered the dragon that was living in them. This is interesting, right? Why? Because there's this ancient story that the world around the nation of Israel knew and understood. And the nation of Israel is playing with their ideas to teach us something true, in spite of the fact that their myth was not true. Interesting. So, as we keep moving, what we're going to discover is this idea of chaos and God directly addressing chaos happens over and over and over again. We saw it last week in the story of David. What we talked about last week in the story of David was every time we find the idea of descent, right? Whether that's moving down or whether that's moving, we're told the nation of Israel goes down into slavery. In the story of David and Goliath, it was you go down into the valley to fight the giant. You are moving, descending into chaos. What's interesting about that is, I'm going to erase again. Sorry, it's going to be a lot of writing today, I'm afraid. What's interesting about that is, at the time this text was written in Genesis 1, they essentially thought of the world in three pieces. And in some ways they weren't wrong. So everything they understood was divided into three sections. Okay, there was the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. Now, the reason this is interesting is because we still think in these terms in a lot of ways. When we're talking about spiritual concepts, this is essentially how we think, right? We live here, but there is a God who lives in the heavens. But when we talk about the idea of hell, where do we reference it? Down, right? For me to get to hell, I have to descend into it. In fact, the text talks about this idea like hell is at the center of the earth. In Jewish texts that are not in our scriptures, and there are texts out there you can study that are ancient Jewish texts that are not in our scriptures. One of them describes the fact that there were a group of demons that get kicked out of heaven. They get sent to earth. They make some really terrible mistakes on earth, and part of their punishment, God locks them in the underworld. Okay, now what's interesting about that is it's described as being an area that is as far beneath the earth as earth is beneath the heavens. So it creates, we get more understanding of this three kind of picture of creation. Now, what's also interesting about this is when we understand that they viewed their world cosmically as three pieces. You have this vertical idea of three, okay? But they also viewed their world horizontally like we do. And when you view your world horizontally or geographically, you get four cardinal directions, right? North, east, south, and west. And when you combine those things, sorry, I made my letters wrong, but when you combine those things, what do you get? 7. Gosh, that's bizarre, right? So they even pictured their world in 7 dimensions, essentially. So there's this idea that as we descend, we move into chaos. We find that idea over and over again in the text. And in fact, there's even a pretty popular teacher right now who's essentially espousing the idea that the entire book of Genesis is a movement from chaos to order. And that the farther we go in Genesis, the more order is created. Okay? In fact, this guy goes so far as to say that pattern isn't just true of Genesis, it's true of the entire book. The farther we get in the book, the more the chaos around our world is addressed. In fact, that kind of reaches one climax, so to speak, at Christ, where we say, gosh, Jesus stepped into the chaos and addressed the chaos of our sin, and now there's a way to order and address our sin as we move forward. Then you get to Revelation, right? What does Revelation do? Revelation brings the chaos to an ultimate end, and according to the text, at the end of Revelation, we're now living in essentially a perfect chaosless existence in the presence of God, right? So there's this idea of chaos that traces itself all the way to the book. God moves his creation from chaos to order. And that ordering is, in fact, one of the most important things we see in Genesis 1. Or what we find in Genesis 1 is that however you break it down, whoever wrote this text understood that God was instituting our world in an orderly fashion. It wasn't haphazard. It wasn't random. That when God stepped into addressing what we find in the text as chaos, he did it in an ordered way, right? Light and darkness, sky, land and sea. Then he populated those three things. As he's moving into greater order. One of the things that I think is also interesting about how this happens is we find that essentially God is not creating a natural order that includes himself. And this is really important. It's a really important idea, because what that means is God is the creator of the trees. God is not in the trees. The trees are not a form of God. The earth is not a form of God. Sorry, my computer did something, but I think we're still running on. Yes, we're good. God is essentially creating out of nothing, and as he creates, he's distanced from his creation. He's separate from it. What's interesting about that idea to me comes back to an idea we touched on a couple weeks ago about Jesus, because essentially God's direct interaction with his creation is only in his words. God speaks and it is created. It happens in Genesis 1, right? God speaks, let there be light, there's light. God says, let there be a sky, let there be an expanse, and let there be water over and under. And he's speaking these things, he's calling them into existence. But God, the way he's touching his creation is through words, which makes John chapter 1, the first few verses, especially interesting, right? Where John says, he's talking about Jesus Christ, and he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, John kind of maps out an idea that is mind-boggling. Essentially, he says, and I'm actually using the words I'm choosing very carefully. John essentially says that Jesus is the magical power that God uses to create, which is crazy. It's a crazy, intense, huge idea. We'd spend the rest of our lives talking about nothing else and still not exhaust it, right? So, but in that, John is also saying Jesus is the Word. He was the word that God spoke at creation. That's how you get kind of this magical idea, which seems weird, but it's cool, right? And then, but beyond that, we find that if that's the case, then Jesus was always touching creation. In fact, in Genesis 1, every time something new from the very beginning to humankind happened, God's interaction with his creation is through his word. So not only does Jesus show up in John as the interaction of God to help solve the chaos of sin, but Jesus was the interaction every single time in the book of Genesis chapter 1 that's separating chaos and destroying it and bringing order to it. This has always been his role. And that's a cool, I just goosebump myself, sorry. That's a cool idea. It's a cool idea. So we're down to about 5 minutes, and I still haven't even made it to Genesis chapter 2 yet, right? So there's this structure, this order that we find in Genesis 1, and that order matters. But what we also find in Genesis chapter 1, and kind of where I want us to end this conversation is, Genesis chapter 1 is written from the perspective of the divine. Okay? And this is important for a handful of reasons. Number one, Genesis chapter 1 is not written from someone didn't watch this happen and then write it down. Okay? So, as someone who believes the text religiously, this means a couple of things. First of all, it means that this is the document we find in Genesis chapter 1. I'm going to be careful because I know I'm going to step on toes and get myself in trouble. But the document we find in Genesis chapter 1 is not scientific, although it has some massive scientific ramifications, which I'll get into in just a second. But it's not scientific in the sense that science is a documentation of what is observable phenomenon to a human. This is what we call science. Genesis chapter 1 was not observable to people. So it's not scientific in that sense. In fact, you could even argue that when Genesis chapter 1 was written, there was not a single scientist on the planet, right? They didn't think of their world the way we think of our world. They didn't try to tackle problems the way we try to tackle problems. And because of that, Genesis chapter 1 was not designed to be a science textbook on how the earth was built and created. It's designed to teach us something spiritual. And the spiritual truth is that God steps into chaos and orders it. Right? What's interesting about that is science, observable phenomenon, is not possible without Genesis chapter 1. Because if the earth is the chaos that we find God moved away from, if the earth is built on chaos, you can't have scientific fact that's observable and repeatable. It's not possible. The same experiment will generate hundreds of different results. But the order that's created in Genesis chapter 1 gives our universe the stability to create repetitive, observable phenomenon, right? So Genesis 1, although my personal take on it is not scientific the way most of us want it to be. Science is impossible without it. That's hard to get away from. God creates order, and we find this text. I mean, we have copies of Genesis 1 that are date to 700 and 800 BCE, so 2,800 years ago, before science was even a concept, before the ideas of it were even being kicked around, like, let's observe repeatable phenomena, let's write about it, let's talk about it as fact, let's move our way through this progression. This text outlined essentially a worldview that made all of that possible. In fact, there are a lot of scholars that believe without this worldview, without the teaching that happened based on the scriptures for the 1,000 years that we call the Middle Ages, without that education system, modern science would be impossible. We would never have made it there. It is actually 1250. So I talked us all through all of that and didn't really even get to any concrete points other than let's hang out here so I know where to start next week, okay? Genesis chapter 1 is a cosmology. It is a story of the creation of the universe from a divine perspective, not from the perspective of man. And this matters immensely when we jump into Genesis 2, which will obviously be next week. So, guys on Facebook, thanks. I promise I'm going somewhere, right? We're setting up what's coming, and all of this information will matter to the story as we keep unfolding it. So thanks for hanging out with me. We will be right back here in a week. We'll pick up Genesis chapter 2, and then we'll look at how those two stories not only complement each other, but some of how they might even kind of butt heads a little bit. But then we'll look at how those two stories play into the rest of the text and why those things matter. So have a great afternoon. We'll be right back here next week. One more thing, if you have questions, type them in the comments. I will do my absolute best to get back and answer them. And we'll hopefully have this video up on YouTube by middle of the day tomorrow.